Hello and welcome to the historynetwork.org podcast. As you may have discovered, we are looking to acquire as many of you as possible as patrons through patreon.com from season 26 onwards. And I want to kick off this episode with a roll call of thanks for all of those of you who have signed up already since I first announced our Patreon call at the beginning of the last episode. A heartfelt thanks from me and Angus to all you Major Generals: Aaron Friedman, Jeremy Burney, Andrew Mast, Mike Jones, Jay Fournier, Norm Donovan, David Lenher, Chris Carter, Massimiliano Pitana, Michael Beach, Richard Lauer, Rodney Holmes, Elizabeth Bruner, Thomas Mixer, Richard Goldblatt and Richard Poulton. And great thanks from Angus and myself to all you Lieutenant Generals who signed up so far: Thomas Cormode, Ben Tay, William B. Kopf, James Thompson, Liam O'Fowlane, Franz Maruna, Mike H. and Jim McCabe. And finally, of course, enormous thanks from us both for all you Major Generals out there: Jeremy Quant, Christopher Witt, Mike Swanson, Tom Mallender and Christopher Krasnowski. Apologies if I have pronounced any of those names incorrectly. Do feel free to let me know if I have. And if you've signed up recently to become a patron and not heard your name read out, then do just bear in mind that these podcasts are recorded a little ahead of their scheduled release time, so you will get a mention next time if you haven't heard your name read out this time. Now, as I mentioned last week, no pledges will be taken until we start season 26. And a quick recap if you haven't yet heard about what we're looking to do from season 26 onwards. Angus and I have been doing this podcast now for the last 12 years. If you've been with us since the beginning, then you'll have been listening to us for that long too. And a huge thanks if you have. Originally, when we started out, we just wanted to give podcasting a go and see if anyone actually wanted to listen. Now, after the 12 years I mentioned and around 9 million downloads, we're wondering what to do with it. It never made us any money and barely covered its costs, and we're certainly not looking to get rich out of it at all. But since those fancy-free days of 12 years ago, a lot of changes have happened, and responsibilities been added in both Angus's and my life, and it's become more difficult to justify finding the time to produce the podcast. We also have contributors now who write episodes for us, thanks to all of you, and it would be great to be able to financially reward them a little for their time and effort. So what does this mean? Well, it means we're going to give the Patreon route a go. If you haven't heard of Patreon, it's like a way of micro-sponsoring each episode we release, and you never pay anything up front. What you do is you go to our Patreon page, pledge an amount you'd like to tip us with per episode, and only when we do actually release a new episode do we get the tip that you pledged. You can also set monthly limits, so if for some reason we had a bit of a spurt on and released a few extra episodes in a month rather than the regular 2, then you'd never go over your monthly limit. It really is simple, and rather than us asking you for $25 or $50 or $100, we're just looking for $1 or 50 cents per episode from as many as you as possible, or whatever you can afford. This current season 25 will remain just as all the others, totally free and delivered in our usual way, with an episode out roughly every fortnight. But come season 26, we'd like to be in a position of having patrons totalling a minimum of $350 per episode. If all our regular listeners gave just a few cents, then that would be covered easily. We'd love you to find out more about our Patreon campaign, and you can do so by simply navigating to patreon.com. That's patreon.com /The History Network. And to summarise what I've said here in this intro, Angus and I have actually recorded a little video. So even if it's just for the inquisitiveness of finding out what we look like in front of a camera, then just go to patreon.com/The History Network and see our Patreon campaign video there, as well as all the blurb on it. Now, working on the podcast for the last 12 years has inspired Angus to return to university to undertake a master's degree. And along the way, he's been pondering the attacks the Germans made of the northeast coast in December 1914, local to where he lives. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 25, Episode 2, Remember Scarborough, a countdown to total war. On the morning of 16th December 1914, at around 8 a.m, the German battle cruisers SMS von der Tann and Derfflinger opened fire on the British coastal resort of Scarborough. For the town's inhabitants, the shelling seemed indiscriminate. The prominent Grand Hotel was hit a number of times, as was the medieval castle overlooking the bay and residential parts of the town. In 30 minutes, 776 shells had been fired, after which the two ships steamed up the coast to attack Whitby, where the Abbey was struck, as was the Coast Guard signal station, along with a handful of other properties. The bombardment only lasted 5 minutes. 10 minutes after the attack on Scarborough had begun, the battle cruisers SMS Seydlitz and Moltke, together with the cruiser Blücher, opened fire on the port of Hartlepool, 40 miles further along the coast from Scarborough. The first raiders were spotted by 4 British destroyers on patrol, HMSs Doon, Test, Waveney and Moy. Whilst outgunned, they closed to get within torpedo range, but coming under accurate fire from the Germans and receiving a number of hits, the small squadron scattered back out of range. The Hugh gun battery on the West Hartlepool headland had been warned of German naval movements off the north-east coast in the early hours of the morning, and live ammunition had been issued. They were able to return effective fire. Of the 3 Royal Navy vessels in port to defend Hartlepool, one cruiser, HMS Forward, was not able to get under steam in time to take part in the action. The light cruiser, HMS Patrol, was attempting to steam out of harbour when she was hit and ran aground. By the time the submarine HMS C9 put to sea, the Germans had gone. In 30 minutes, the attacking ships had wreaked devastation on Hartlepool. Densely populated areas of the town had been hit hard, killing 122 and injuring another 424. At Scarborough, 19 had been killed, including a 14-month-old baby. A British Army recruitment poster would later read, "Remember Scarborough, a rallying call for young men to join the army to fight in France." The incident, now not well known beyond the confines of the northeast of Britain, was a big international news story in 1914, with headlines in the American press such as "German warships break through British lines." It seemed shocking that the Germans could challenge the dominance of the Royal Navy and strike at the British homeland. But why did they attack? The British were at great pains to explain that Scarborough and Whitby were innocent, with no military garrison there. In America, Scarborough was described as a resort town and Queen of the Watering Holes, whilst Hartlepool, being a large port, did have the means to attempt to defend itself. The attack in no way posed any real threat to the progress of the war. To answer the question of why these towns were targeted, we need to look at the bigger picture of the war. On land, Germans had been stopped at the Marne in September 1914. The fighting at the front had reached a stalemate by December. The war needed new theatres in which to fight. At sea, the British Grand Fleet, commanded by Admiral John Jellicoe, faced the German High Seas Fleet, both vast. Each nation had poured millions of pounds into their creation, so much so neither side were willing to face off at sea for fear of the consequences if they lost. Of Jellicoe, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill would say that he was the only man on either side who could lose the war in an afternoon. The British strategy was to concentrate the Royal Navy at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands. By positioning the Grand Fleet here, they prevented German shipping entering the Atlantic. With the English Channel also denied to the Germans, they were blockaded. The German High Seas Fleet was outnumbered. There was little they could do to challenge the Royal Navy, unless they could redress the balance of power in the North Sea. Friedrich von Ingenohl, Commander-in-Chief of the High Seas Fleet, believed a raid on the north-east coast would force the Royal Navy to send some capital ships from the Grand Fleet after the raiders. Waiting in ambush would be the German High Seas Fleet. What proved to be contentious is the choice of targets, 2 of the 3 seemingly having no military bearing upon the war. But this is the British narrative of the events. From the outset, the English-speaking newspapers claimed Scarborough to be innocent and of no military threat. The Scarborough Pictorial attempted to validate this position when, in early January 1915, it carried a quote from the German historian Friedrich Bernhardi, stating that targets can only be justified if they house armed forces of the hostile state. The Times, the day after the attack, declared the raids of no military significance. Another article, appearing the same day, described Scarborough as a resort town and Whitby as a fishing village. The idea of the targets being illegitimate was created right from the start. It would seem the mystery of the target selection is only a British problem. This could be due to the British being trapped by their interpretation of the war, not willing to understand or look at the German justification and evidence. The week after the raid took place, the American German language paper, the Deutsche Herald of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, quoted the German attaché in Washington, who stated that the 3 towns were indeed defended, and therefore the attack was not in breach of the Hague Conventions. The 1907 Hague Convention stated that the bombardment by naval forces of undefended ports, towns, villages, dwellings or buildings is forbidden. From German sources there is evidence to suggest that Hartlepool's defences were known. The Germans believed that Scarborough had a small gun battery and that the Whitby Coast Guard station was operated by naval personnel. This is supported with orders from Admiral Hipper to the relevant ships at Scarborough to target the waterworks, gasworks, railway station and the Coast Guard battery next to the Grand Hotel. To minimise civilian risk, only light and medium weapons were to be used unless fired upon. Whilst only circumstantial at best, it has been suggested that Germans visiting Scarborough before the war may have learned of the old gun battery at the castle, which had once been described as the finest coastal battery in England. This may have been reported to the German Imperial Navy. Though one practical reason could well be that the English north-east coast was the closest point in Britain to strike when the German fleet sailed west from its prime base at Wilhelmshaven. This is important because the German High Seas Fleet was under orders not to sail too far from the German coast for fear of being attacked. Putting to sea in support of the raiders allowed the fleet to get as close to the British coast as it could, but at the same time it allowed the German High Seas Fleet to retreat back to port in the event of being threatened by the whole British Grand Fleet. For all the consternation which the attack would later cause, it was not wholly unexpected. Intercepted signals indicated German naval movements in and around the area, although not of their intentions. The decision made by the Admiralty was to wait and see what developed and then react to that. In Churchill's account of the events, he insists the Royal Navy had no intelligence of the German High Seas Fleet having put to sea, so the decision was taken to keep the bulk of the Grand Fleet in harbour at Scarborough Flow to avoid unnecessary wear and tear, but to dispatch 2 squadrons from the fleet to patrol. What Churchill fails to mention is that Admiral Jellicoe was in favour of sending out the entire Grand Fleet before the attack. Jellicoe feared that if the High Seas Fleet had put to sea, the 2 squadrons would be overwhelmed. If the British strategy was to preserve the High Seas Fleet for a major engagement, as Churchill suggests, the tactic of deploying limited British squadrons to investigate the activities of the German Navy was exactly the lure which Ingenohl had hoped would work. It was only by luck the British squadrons missed the German High Seas Fleet. The loss of those Royal Navy ships would have gone a long way to equalising the balance of power in the North Sea. Jellicoe had been proved correct in his instinct to send out the whole fleet, something Churchill fails to mention in his account of the events. The inaction of the Royal Navy was certainly questioned at the time. The Times makes an attempt to justify the performance of the Navy in an editorial piece 2 days after the raid, arguing that the Grand Fleet needed to operate as a single body and not be distributed in ineffectual penny packets. As a result of this concentration, a fast enemy squadron will always have a chance of getting through. The Daily Mirror supported the narrative, which Churchill would later build upon, that the Royal Navy engaged the enemy, but rather than stand and fight the German ships, retreated into fog and disappeared. Meanwhile, local newspapers in the northeast of England were critical of the Royal Navy. A local newspaper article questioned the Admiralty's version of events, suggesting that whilst the enemy may have been engaged as they retreated, why had there been no competent Royal Navy deterrent off the coast to meet the German cruisers when they arrived? On the national level, it was easy for the press to support the Royal Navy. At the local level, to those in the northeast who had been shelled, where was the Navy, would seem a perfectly valid question. Allowing a bombardment of the British coast was undoubtedly a failure for the Royal Navy. There were 7 vessels present at Hartlepool, all proved ineffective at stopping the German raid. A number of questions remained unanswered. If, as Churchill states, British intelligence suggested the Germans were putting to sea, why did the Royal Navy vessels in the harbour at Hartlepool not put to sea? Clearly the local artillery battery at West Hartlepool had been made aware of a possible threat, as live ammunition had been issued. Whilst many newspapers backed the Admiralty's actions, the Sheffield Daily Telegraph likened the Royal Navy's problem of finding roving German ships to locating a mobile needle trying to elude observation. Locally, the Northern Daily Mail, printed in Hartlepool, hoped that the region would not be allowed to become a target in the interest of a higher strategy. The fear was the strategy of keeping the Grand Fleet concentrated at Scarborough Flow did not allow enough Royal Navy vessels to patrol British coastal waters, preventing further German raids. The north-east coast, by Churchill's own admission, did indeed succumb to higher strategy. It is notable that during his time as Lord of the Admiralty, he engages the people of the region in a widely published letter to the Mayor of Scarborough, mourning the deaths of the peaceful inhabitants. Yet in his memoir of the war, he hardly gives the victims of the bombardment a mention, in favour of narrating the higher strategy, something which puts him at centre stage. But what did all this mean for Britain in December 1914? It can be argued that one result of the bombardment was the bombing of civilian targets in the northeast of Britain was one of the first steps towards a total war, a war which transcended the confines of the battlefield, bringing the whole of society into the war. In 1914, the war was something that happened in France and Belgium, fought by soldiers. But what could the Germans expect to gain by bombarding civilian targets on British soil? The attack certainly did help the population of Britain take a mental step toward the idea of total war. In December 1914, Yorkshire, a pamphlet was issued, instructing what to do in the event of invasion. Roads were allocated as military roads and muster points were drawn up in case of the need to evacuate the urban civilian population to rural areas. By January 1915, even children were drawn into the war effort. The Hartlepool Daily Mail informed its readership that schoolgirls in the town were now making mittens for men at the front. War was now not something that happened elsewhere. Since September 1914, voluntary recruitment figures for the army had been falling. Since the high water mark in September, where over 400,000 men had stepped forward to join the colours. By December, the number volunteering had dropped to 117,000. It can be argued that the outcry against the attack on innocent British women and children in the press, and successfully harnessed by recruitment officers, caused a temporary rise in the number of those volunteering, when in January over 155,000 men came forward. It would be the biggest single month for voluntary recruitment in 1915. By the middle of January, Scarborough would be pushed from the front pages of newspapers as Germany would launch the first of the Zeppelin raids when the giant airships visited coastal towns in Norfolk. The bombardment of Scarborough, Whitby and Hartlepool had a subtle effect upon the British public. Before the raid, the war was being fought on mainland Europe. The shelling of the three towns brought the war to Britain, with home-grown refugees fleeing the coast. There undoubtedly was an increase in recruitment following the raid, though probably not to the extent the figures might first suggest. The war was creeping into everyone's lives. While being urged to carry on as normal, school children were spurred on to make gloves for men at the front. Residents of the coast were instructed on what to do in the event of a German invasion, and the holiday makers at Scarborough would be taking their donkey rides amongst sandbags and barbed wire defences. The realisation would grow throughout 1915 with the use of gas at Ypres and the sinking of the Lusitania, that this was a war where all resources would need to be mobilised to win. The bombardment was the start of the countdown to the British accepting total war. Do remember to go along to patreon.com/The History Network to find out all about what we're thinking of doing for season 26 onwards. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Angus Wallace, read by Nick Barker.